I had worked 40 years to keep food on that table, and yet when I arrived last Thanksgiving there was no chair set for me. Not even a stool in the corner, just a neat row of polished seats for everyone else, and an empty space where mine should have been. If you've ever built your life around a family only to feel erased in your own house, you'll understand why that image, an empty chair at the head of the table, cut deeper than any words could. Before I go further, let me pause. If stories like this strike a chord with you, if you've ever felt unseen or pushed aside by those you love, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. I read them all and your voices remind me I'm not alone. Now, let me tell you how it unfolded. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon. Laughter bounced off the walls. My daughter-in-law, Claire, directed the seating like a conductor leading an orchestra. "You sit here, you two over there, perfect." Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes never once looked at me. I waited, coat still on, clutching the small bottle of wine I'd saved for weeks to buy. When the last chair slid into place, I realized there was none left for me. The empty spot at the table had been pushed against the wall, as though deliberately forgotten. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone was late. Maybe another chair would be pulled out. But when I caught my son's uneasy glance, I knew this wasn't an accident. I placed the bottle on the counter quietly and stepped back into the hallway. My heart pounded not from anger at first, but from shame. The kind you feel when everyone else knows a joke and you are the joke. From the hallway, I could still see them raise their glasses. The words drifted out muffled, but I caught enough. "To new beginnings," Claire said. To what beginnings, I wondered. New for whom? I stayed by the doorframe, my back pressed against the wood. It felt like I was 14 again, left outside the basketball team because I wasn't tall enough. Except this time it wasn't about height. It was about my worth in my own family. The sound of forks clinking and chairs creaking mixed with bursts of laughter. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I told myself it was fine, that they had younger people to seat, that maybe they needed room. But deep down, I felt the sting of being deliberately erased. I moved further into the house, into the living room where photographs lined the mantel. There I was, years ago, holding my newborn grandson. My hands looked stronger in that picture, thick with calluses from a lifetime in construction. I had built houses for strangers, brick by brick, and I had built this family with the same hands. Yet those hands were now shaking, gripping the edge of the fireplace as though it were the only thing keeping me upright. The chatter from the dining room grew louder, and suddenly I caught Claire's voice again. "Now we can finally, it's all ours." The words hung in the air like a blade. I couldn't make out the rest, but I didn't need to. Something was being claimed, something I had worked for. I tightened my jaw. Part of me wanted to storm back in, demand my chair, slam my hand on the table. But another part told me to wait, to listen. Sometimes silence reveals more than confrontation. It was then that I noticed a small leather-bound notebook resting on the side table near the window. It didn't belong to me. Its cover was worn, corners bent from use. Someone must have set it down in the rush of arrivals. I don't know why my eyes fixed on it, maybe fate, maybe instinct, but I picked it up. My fingers brushed the embossed initials, C.R., Claire's name. I hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were neat columns of numbers, handwritten notes, underlined phrases, property sale, final signatures, transfer by December. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just a notebook, it was a plan, my family's plan. I closed it quickly as footsteps approached. I slid the notebook beneath my coat just as my grandson burst into the room, cheeks red from running. "Grandpa, why aren't you eating?" he asked innocently. I forced a smile. "Just resting, buddy, just resting." Behind him, Claire appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. For a split second, I thought she noticed the missing notebook. Her smile was quick, practiced. "Everything okay in here?" "Of course," I said, voice steady though my heart raced. She lingered, eyes darting once more to the side table, then back at me. Finally she left, but not before tightening her grip on the doorframe. I exhaled only when she disappeared. I sat down in the armchair, notebook hidden under my coat. My mind raced. The laughter from the dining room no longer sounded like joy. It sounded like victory chants, and I wasn't invited to the celebration. The twist of it all struck me then. They hadn't just forgotten my chair. They had already begun carving me out of everything else. I looked again at the photographs on the mantel. My late wife's smile in one, my children's faces in another. They had all once depended on me, and now I was the one disposable. But they had made a mistake. In their arrogance, they had left behind the very record of their scheme, and it was in my hands now. I leaned back in the chair, feeling its leather creak beneath me. The sounds of celebration carried on unaware. My pulse slowed, no longer frantic but focused. They thought the empty chair was a symbol of my irrelevance. They didn't realize it had given me the perfect vantage point to see everything. And in that silence I decided this story would not end with me excluded. It would end with truth on my side. That night I left the house with the notebook still under my coat. The wind outside was sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. My footsteps crunched over fallen leaves as I walked to my car. The chair had been empty at the table, but in my heart a new seat was being carved, one of resolve. The feast went on without me, but the real reckoning was yet to begin. The ride home that night felt longer than it ever had before. Streetlights smeared across the windshield, golden streaks bending in the rain. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the leather warm beneath my palms. I had carried 1,000 tools through storms, but that small leather notebook pressed against my ribs weighed more than all of them. I should have been at that table, carving turkey with the rest of them, telling the same old stories I'd told every holiday. Instead, I was a shadow, sliding away unnoticed, holding the truth they thought I'd never see. When I reached my house, the silence hit me first. No laughter, no voices, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I hung my coat on the chair by the door and set the notebook on the kitchen table. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. The cover gleamed in the dim light. My reflection wavered on the leather like a stranger I barely recognized. The man staring back was older, lonelier, but not defeated. I flipped the notebook open again, slower this time. The words were deliberate, written in Claire's tidy hand. Page after page described assets, valuations, potential buyers, and dates circled in red ink. There were sketches of property lines, lists of items I hadn't realized anyone else had noticed. My old truck, the lake cabin, even the workshop out back with its rusted tools. They had been cataloging my life piece by piece. I turned another page and stopped. A phrase leapt out, underlined twice: exclude permanently. No context, no explanation, just those two words standing alone like a verdict. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight. My breath came slow, controlled, though my chest felt like a furnace. Exclude permanently. I whispered the words aloud, tasting their cruelty. It wasn't enough to move me aside at the table. They wanted me erased from the picture entirely. I thought about my son, Daniel, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders through county fairs, the boy who used to slip his small hand into mine when crossing the street. His signature was on the bottom corner of one page. The ink was fresh, darker than the rest. He had agreed to this. A knock at the window startled me. Just a branch scraping against the glass in the wind, but my pulse leapt. For the first time in years, I felt hunted in my own home. I pushed the notebook shut and slid it into a drawer. My coffee mug still sat on the counter, rim stained from the morning. I poured the last of the pot, though it had gone cold, and drank anyway. Bitterness fit the night. As I sat there, the images replayed, the empty chair, the raised glasses, the words about new beginnings. My mind kept circling back to one thought: they believed I wouldn't notice. They believed I was too old, too tired, too trusting. They were wrong. The clock ticked past midnight. I rose from the table and walked through the darkened rooms. The house smelled faintly of pine from the boards I'd installed decades ago. My hands brushed along the walls I had built with care, walls that had heard every argument, every laughter, every lullaby. Now those same walls would hear something new, the sound of resolve hardening. When I finally lay down, sleep refused to come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster. Every crack told a story, storms weathered, years endured. They reminded me that even broken things could stand strong if the foundation held. The notebook waited downstairs, patient as a loaded weapon. I knew when dawn came, it would still be there, and I would have to decide what to do with it. I woke the next morning with the taste of ashes in my mouth, though no fire had burned. Sleep had been shallow, fractured by dreams where chairs scraped across floors and glasses clinked in mocking rhythm. When I sat up, the gray light of dawn cut through the blinds like cold knives. The notebook still waited downstairs. I could feel its presence as though it had grown heavier in the night, as though the leather binding had soaked up my unrest. But I didn't open it again. Not yet. Some wounds are worse when you keep picking at them. Instead, I poured a fresh pot of coffee and stepped out to the porch. The November air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. I sat there, cradling the mug in my hands, listening to the neighborhood slowly wake. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, but my thoughts circled back to last night, to the chair that wasn't mine. I remembered the way Daniel had avoided my eyes, the way Claire's smile never touched her face, and I remembered the faint words drifting through the doorframe, new beginnings. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a toast, the kind of thing people say on holidays without thinking. But the more I replayed it, the more it echoed. A toast isn't just words, it's a proclamation, and I hadn't been part of it. By mid-morning, I found myself back in the truck, engine grumbling like an old friend reluctant to wake. I told myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head. Yet somehow the road curved toward Daniel's neighborhood. My hands turned the wheel without asking permission from my mind. The closer I got, the tighter my chest felt. Houses lined the street, each one decorated with wreaths and pumpkins. Life moved on here, ordinary and cheerful. But for me, the world had tilted. I parked a few houses down, telling myself I wasn't spying, just visiting. The laughter from last night still rang in my ears, and I needed to see it in daylight to make sense of what had happened. From the curb, I could see into the dining room window. The table still stood dressed with its white cloth and centerpiece of autumn flowers. Plates stacked in the sink, glasses left half full, evidence of a celebration that had carried on without me. I sat in the truck, engine off, and the silence pressed heavy. Then voices drifted through an open window. Claire's voice, softer than last night but no less sharp, carried clearly in the still air. "To finally having everything in order," she said. Another voice responded, Daniel's. "We've waited long enough, Dad won't be a problem." The words slammed into me like a hammer. My hand clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles widened. I wanted to leave, to drive off and pretend I hadn't heard, but something pinned me there. I cracked the truck door and stepped out, moving closer across the damp lawn. Each step felt like trespass, but the need to know pulled me forward. Through the thin curtains, I saw them. Claire, standing with a glass of wine, though it was barely noon, and Daniel leaning against the counter. Their posture was relaxed, almost celebratory. Claire lifted her glass higher, to new ownership, to moving forward. Daniel clinked his glass against hers, to freedom. I froze beneath the window. Their words weren't careless. They weren't the vague sentiments of a holiday toast. They were declarations, intentional. My stomach turned. The notebook hadn't lied. This wasn't paranoia. It was confirmation. I shifted my weight and a twig snapped beneath my shoe. Both their heads turned sharply toward the window. I flattened myself against the wall, breath caught in my throat. My heart thudded loud enough I feared it would give me away. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered. "Probably nothing," Daniel replied after a pause. "Maybe a delivery truck." But his tone carried unease. I stayed still, every muscle screaming, until their voices resumed. Claire's voice dropped to a murmur. "He's getting suspicious. Last night the way he looked around, did you see?" "He won't fight us," Daniel said. "He's too tired, too used to giving in." A bitter laugh followed. "Then by Christmas it's ours. I shut my eyes, the word ours stung sharper than any insult. Not families, not all of us, just theirs. I slipped back to the truck, careful, quiet, though inside my mind roared. I started the engine and pulled away, each block feeling like distance from betrayal yet also like retreat. The drive home blurred, but one phrase etched itself deeper each mile. He won't fight us. They believed that. They counted on it. When I reached my driveway, I didn't go inside immediately. I sat there, hands still on the wheel, watching the house I had built rise steady before me. Boards I had nailed, windows I had set, bricks I had laid with sweat and patience. This house had stood storms, and so had I. The notebooks still waited on the kitchen table. Their signatures, their plans, their careless confidence, it was all there. I realized then that the empty chair hadn't been humiliation, it had been revelation. They had shown me their intent, and in doing so they had underestimated me. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the walls in amber light, I opened the notebook again. This time, I wasn't just a wounded man peering into betrayal. I was a builder studying blueprints. Only the structure wasn't wood or brick, it was the truth. Every line, every note, every plan they had sketched, I read with the eye of a craftsman. And slowly, a different kind of construction began in my mind. Not walls or roofs, but strategy. The toast they made, whispered in a kitchen they thought was safe, had sealed more than their plan. It had sealed my resolve. The house grew quiet around me. Outside, the wind rattled the last leaves from the trees. And inside, I sat with pen in hand, beginning to write my own notes in the margins of theirs. Not out of vengeance, but out of survival. Because they were wrong about one thing: I would fight. And this time, I would not be the one standing outside the window. That night I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The house around me was steady, walls humming with the quiet sounds of pipes and the faint crackle of the furnace, but my mind churned like a river after heavy rain. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice again. He won't fight us. I rose before dawn, boots heavy against the floorboards I had laid 30 years earlier. My hands trailed along the walls as if reminding myself, this was mine, made by sweat and patience, not by signatures in a notebook. I brewed coffee and walked to the workshop out back. The air smelled of sawdust and oil, faint remnants of years spent fixing, building, shaping. The tools were still lined on the wall, some rusted, others polished by decades of grip. Each hammer, wrench, and plane was more than steel, it was memory. I ran my fingers along the wooden workbench. It bore the marks of projects long finished. The scratch from when Daniel tried to carve his name at age 12, the dark stain where I'd spilled varnish, the dent from when I dropped a beam too hard. This bench had witnessed my life as much as any photograph. I sat on the stool and let the memories come. I remembered my first big job, the county library expansion. I had been a young man then, green but determined. I worked 18-hour days, eating cold sandwiches on the scaffold, chasing deadlines. When the ribbon was cut, my chest swelled because I knew the structure would outlive me. Then the years of raising a family. I remembered carrying Daniel on my shoulders while I hammered shingles into our roof. He laughed every time the hammer struck, a rhythm he said sounded like music. I remembered Claire visiting for the first time, back when she was only his girlfriend, marveling at the shelves I'd built in the living room. For decades, I built not just structures but a sense of permanence. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough, the family would stay solid, unshakable. Now those same hands that once built were trembling, not from age but from betrayal. I pulled the notebook from my coat pocket, flipping again to the page with Daniel's signature. My own son, the boy who once held a flashlight while I fixed the car engine, now drafting plans to sell the very land I had fought to keep. The sting wasn't just about money. It was about memory, about legacy. That cabin by the lake wasn't an asset. It was where we'd fish together, where my late wife read books on the porch while Daniel caught his first trout. To see it reduced to ink on a page felt like seeing her memory erased. I leaned forward, elbows on the bench, face in my hands. How had we arrived here? Was there a moment I missed? a fracture too small to notice until it spread like a crack across glass. Maybe it began the day I retired. Suddenly, I wasn't the provider, just a man with calloused hands and more stories than anyone wanted to hear. Or maybe it started when my wife passed, and the house grew quieter, leaving space for ambitions to whisper. Whatever the origin, the result was the same. I had become, in their eyes, expendable. The workshop felt smaller, walls pressing close. I stood and opened the back door, letting the cold air flood in. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promises a hard frost by nightfall. I stepped into the yard, boots crunching over frost-bitten grass. From here, I could see the outline of the property, the garden beds, the fence I mended every spring, the oak tree where Daniel once hung a tire swing. Each corner of this land carried a story, and each story carried me. I thought of that empty chair again. Not just wood and fabric, but a symbol. A deliberate absence. It was as though they had already buried me while I still breathed. But as I stood there, staring at the horizon, something steadied inside me. Exclusion could wound, yes, but it could also awaken. I walked back inside, fetched a pencil, and opened the notebook once more. This time, I wasn't just reading their plans. I began scribbling my own notes in the margins, dates, reminders, questions. I knew people, old colleagues, friends at the bank, men and women who respected what I had built. Their names filled the pages alongside Daniel's cold ink. They believed I wouldn't fight, but a lifetime of building had taught me patience, strategy, endurance. By late afternoon, fatigue pressed heavy, but my mind burned clear. I reheated leftovers, barely tasting them, and returned to the living room. The photographs stared back at me from the mantel. One in particular caught my eye. Our 10th anniversary trip to the mountains. My wife was laughing, hair tossed by wind, Daniel clinging to her arm. That picture was proof that once, love and loyalty were real. Somewhere along the way it had soured. I held the frame in my hands. The glass reflected my face, lined, weary but alive, not finished. I replaced it gently, then sank into the recliner. Dusk seeped into the room, shadows stretching long. The house was quiet except for the faint groan of settling wood. And then, as if carried by the silence itself, I heard the echo of last night's toast to new beginnings. Only this time I answered it aloud, voice steady in the empty room. To truth. The evening deepened. Outside, the first stars pricked the sky. I took up the notebook once more and flipped to the final pages. There in Claire's script was a timeline, meetings, calls, legal phrases underlined. December, January, they were planning to move quickly. I closed the book, feeling the edges bite into my palms. They thought I was too blind to notice, too tired to resist. But they had underestimated the man who had built every nail, every wall, every board of the life they were trying to claim. The memories of labor, every job site, every sacrifice, were not just nostalgia. They were foundation. And foundations, if strong enough, can hold against any storm. That night, as I locked the workshop and headed back inside, I knew one thing with certainty. The fight had already begun. The following weekend, Daniel invited the family again. He said it was just a simple get-together, nothing formal, but I knew better. After what I had overheard, nothing felt simple anymore. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting in a room where every smile might be a mask, every laugh another stitch in a net being woven around me, it made my stomach churn. But I also knew absence would feed their story, the old man withdrawing, too weary to participate. I would not give them that satisfaction, so I went. The house was alive with voices when I arrived. Coats piled on the banister, children darting through the hallways, the smell of roast chicken thick in the air. It should have felt warm. Instead, it pressed on me like humidity before a storm. Claire greeted me with that same practiced cheer. "So glad you could come," she said, though her eyes flicked past me, scanning the foyer for someone more important. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, though inside my chest tightened. Every move now felt like theater. The dining room was already full. My chair, my rightful place, was missing again, replaced by a decorative vase on the sideboard. They didn't even pretend this time. I settled into a corner of the living room instead, where I could still hear the conversation but remain out of their immediate gaze. From there, I observed. My son laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Claire kept directing the flow of talk, dropping hints about transitions and fresh starts. None of it was said plainly, but the undertones were sharp enough for me to taste. I tried to focus on the children. My granddaughter, Lucy, twirled near the fireplace in a dress patterned with tiny stars. She reminded me of her grandmother, my late wife, carefree in a world too complicated for her age. When she caught me watching, she ran over and pressed a paper crown into my hand. "For you, Grandpa," she whispered before dashing away. The crown was flimsy gold foil already creased, but I set it gently on my knee like a relic. In that moment, it was the only honest gift in the house. After dinner, people drifted between rooms. Voices rose and fell, glasses clinked, and the children's laughter mixed with the drone of adult conversation. I stayed seated in the corner, invisible but listening. It was then that I noticed it on the armchair across from me. A leather notebook, dark brown, edges frayed from use. My pulse quickened. I recognized it instantly. The same notebook I had found the week before, the one I had smuggled home and studied in silence. Yet here it was again, abandoned casually on a chair as though it were no more than a shopping list. For a moment, doubt tangled me. Had I imagined it? Could there be two? But the embossed initials on the cover were the same, C.R. Claire's. I glanced around. She was in the kitchen, laughing with a cousin, oblivious. Daniel was bent over a conversation with two uncles, gesturing with his hands the way he always did when talking business. No one watched me. I leaned forward, heart hammering, and slid the notebook into my lap. The leather felt warm, as though it had been held tightly not long ago. I flipped it open with slow, deliberate care. Pages filled with the same neat handwriting, the same lists of assets, property lines, timelines. But there were new entries now. Notes scribbled in the margins, arrows pointing to deadlines that had passed since last week. One line chilled me: finalized transfer of workshop tools. My tools. The very ones that hung on the wall of my workshop like old friends. They weren't just pieces of metal to me, they were my history, my craft, my identity. To see them reduced to inventory made my jaw clench. I turned another page. Names I didn't recognize appeared: lawyers, buyers, agencies. Underlined dates, meetings scheduled without my knowledge. It wasn't just planning anymore, it was execution. I felt the blood rise to my face. Around me, the noise of the gathering blurred, voices fading into a hum. All I saw was the page before me. Every word was another nail in a coffin they thought they were building for me. I closed the notebook halfway, breathing slow, steadying myself. This was evidence, proof. They had left it carelessly, confident I would never dare touch it. That arrogance was my opening. But I couldn't let them see my discovery, not yet. I slipped the notebook under my coat, heart pounding. My hands shook slightly as I rose from the chair. Going for some air, I muttered to no one in particular and stepped out onto the porch. The night was crisp, stars sharp against the velvet sky. I leaned against the railing, letting the cold calm my racing blood. In my coat, the notebook pressed against me like a second heartbeat. I thought of my wife again, how she used to remind me that every structure has weak points. Even the strongest house could fall if you found the right beam to strike. Maybe this notebook was that weak point. I opened it again under the porch light, scanning the pages. My eyes caught another phrase circled in red: exclude permanently. The same as before, repeated, emphasized. It was no accident, no passing thought. It was their goal. Exclude me permanently, from the house, from the land, from the family. I closed the notebook and gripped the railing until the wood dug into my palms. The cold air filled my lungs, steadying me. They thought the empty chair would shame me into silence. They thought their whispered toasts would go unheard. They thought this notebook was safe in plain sight. They were wrong on all counts. From inside, I heard laughter again, muffled through the glass. They celebrated while I stood outside, holding the very proof of their betrayal. I slipped the notebook deeper into my coat and straightened. If they wanted new beginnings, I would give them one. but not the one they expected. I left their house with the notebook pressed tight beneath my coat, the night air biting at my face. The drive home was silent except for the steady hum of the engine and the thudding in my chest. Each streetlight I passed seemed to spotlight the truth. My family was planning not just to edge me aside, but to dismantle everything I had built. When I stepped into my kitchen, the house felt different, colder. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the smell of pine from the wood paneling, none of it comforted me. I set the notebook on the table, turned on the single lamp, and opened it wide. This time, I forced myself to read every page. The opening sections were clinical, lists of assets, valuations, insurance policies. But the further I went, the sharper the language became. Whole sections were devoted to strategies, how to approach potential buyers, which relatives to keep onside, which friends of mine were likely to resist. I stopped at one page where my own workshop was described as obsolete structure, potential lot for sale. Obsolete. The bench where I had taught Daniel to plane wood, the walls lined with tools bearing his initials from boyhood, erased with a single word. Another entry chilled me more. Medical decline projected 2-3 years. Ensure guardianship transition in place. They had charted my life expectancy like a business forecast, complete with arrows and question marks. My age, my recent checkups, even the medication I'd filled at the pharmacy, every detail was cataloged. It wasn't just greed, it was premeditated erasure. I leaned back, chest heavy, breath ragged. The penmanship was so careful, so deliberate. Each stroke felt like a cut across my skin. Halfway through, I found a page marked with sticky notes. In Claire's handwriting, it read, "Exclude permanently before March. Execute transfer by spring." Underneath, in Daniel's hand, were numbers, sale projections, down payments, mortgage restructuring. They were building a future brick by brick, but with my life's work as their raw material. My hands trembled. For years, I had thought my legacy was safe in their care. I believed that by handing them the fruits of my labor, they would honor the sweat it had taken to build. Now I realized they had been studying me as if I were a blueprint, not a father. I closed my eyes and heard again the toast, to new ownership, to freedom. Their words weren't metaphors. They were mission statements. I pushed the notebook away and stood. The room felt too small, the air too thin. I paced the floor, the lamp casting my shadow long against the wall. For a moment, despair nearly buckled my knees. The people I loved most had reduced me to a line item. My son, my daughter-in-law. They weren't just plotting to take what I had, they were rewriting me out of my own story. But then another thought came, steadier, sharper. If they could plan, so could I. I returned to the table and pulled the notebook back toward me. This time, I wasn't a victim reading his sentence. I was a builder studying flaws in a structure. I examined their timelines, their assumptions. They counted on my silence. They assumed I would retreat, too weary to resist. They relied on secrecy, believing the notebook safe because I was blind to their whispers. But they had underestimated me. I took out a pad of yellow paper and began jotting notes of my own. Next to their circled "exclude permanently," I wrote, "document evidence." Next to transfer by spring, I scribbled, "secure title deeds, review legal options." Every betrayal they penned became a point of leverage in my plan. As midnight passed, the house around me grew still, yet my mind sharpened. For the first time in days, I felt clarity. At one point, I turned a page and found photographs slipped into the fold, copies of deeds, receipts, even pictures of my workshop. They had photographed my tools, labeling them by resale value. Seeing those familiar saws and hammers reduced to catalog entries ignited something hot in my chest. I remembered the day I first bought that set of tools, back when money was tight and every purchase meant sacrifice. I had carried them home like treasure, knowing they would shape not just wood but the course of my life. And now, my son had listed them as sellable equipment. That was the moment the despair hardened into resolve. The last section of the notebook was the most damning, a draft letter to a law firm. The language was precise, clinical. "We seek to expedite transition of ownership." The current holder is advanced in age and increasingly incapable of managing affairs. Advanced in age, incapable. I set the notebook down slowly. My reflection stared back at me from the lamp's glow, eyes dark but alive. I was not incapable. I was not finished. They thought they were preparing a smooth handover. What they were really doing was handing me the proof I needed. I gathered the notebook and slipped it into a locked drawer in my study. Tomorrow, I would begin making calls. Old friends in business, men at the bank who still owed me favors, even a lawyer or two who remembered the contracts I had signed decades ago. If they wanted a fight, I would not just defend. I would build. I stood by the window, watching the frost spread across the lawn, silver in the moonlight. My breath fogged the glass. Somewhere out there, Daniel and Claire likely believed they were safe, laughing at their cleverness. But I had their blueprint now. And a builder who knows the plan of his enemy does not fear collapse. He prepares to rebuild stronger. The morning after I uncovered the full scope of their plans, I woke with a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. Sleep had come late, but when the sun cut across my curtains, I rose without hesitation. The notebook was locked safely in my study drawer, and with it my fear. What remained was resolve. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, legal pad spread before me. The yellow pages filled with my handwriting, dates, names, leverage points. It looked less like a diary of betrayal now and more like blueprints for a new project. And I had built plenty of those in my lifetime. The first call I made was to Tom Bradley. Tom wasn't just the president of the bank. He was a golfing partner, a man I'd known for 25 years. We'd weathered recessions together, shared quiet drinks after funerals, laughed about our kids' school plays. When he answered, his voice carried its usual warmth. "Alan, I was just thinking of you, haven't seen you on the course in a while." I kept my tone casual, though my fingers drummed on the table. "Been busy. Listen, Tom, I need to review some account protections. Hypothetically, if someone tried to move assets without my consent, how quickly could I shut that down?" There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Hypothetically, depends on how much trouble you're expecting." I stared at the notebook drawer. "Let's just say I'd sleep better knowing locks are in place." "Then come in this week," Tom said. "We'll freeze what needs freezing. No one touches a dime without your say-so." Relief trickled through me. One brick set in place. The next call was harder. Marcus Webb, my accountant. A younger man, sharp with numbers, who'd been with me long enough to know where the real weight of my business lay. He answered briskly, already at his desk. "Marcus, it's Alan. I need you to pull together all ownership documents, properties, investments, everything, quietly." He hesitated. "Is there a problem?" I almost told him everything. The betrayal, the notebook, the words exclude permanently, but I kept it simple. "Let's call it a precaution. You'll understand soon." Marcus didn't press. "You'll have the files by Friday. No one else will know." Another brick. As the day stretched on, I walked the perimeter of my property, boots crunching over frost. The oak tree, the garden, the workshop, all were mine. Yet for the first time I saw them as if from a stranger's eyes. What could be sold, what could be seized, what could be stripped away? The thought sickened me, but instead of despair it lit something harder inside me. If they wanted to turn my life into inventory, then I would remind them. A builder knows the true value of foundations. That afternoon I drove into town. The familiar streets felt different, like allies waiting to be called. At the hardware store, the clerk greeted me by name. At the diner, the waitress poured my coffee before I asked. These people had watched me work year after year, building homes and fixing roofs. Their loyalty wasn't bought with signatures, it was earned. I realized then, Claire and Daniel had underestimated more than just me. They had underestimated the community that knew me. By evening, my study had transformed. Papers spread across the desk, folders stacked neatly, my yellow notes pinned to the wall. It looked less like a home office and more like a war room. I opened the notebook again, not with dread but with a craftsman's eye. Their deadlines were bold, but their assumptions were sloppy. They assumed no oversight, no resistance, no witnesses. That arrogance was my greatest weapon. I underlined their phrase, "finalized transfer by spring." Next to it I wrote, block legal routes, secure allies. Then, almost without realizing, I whispered aloud, you thought I wouldn't fight, you thought wrong. As the night deepened, I sat back in my chair. Memories flooded me, nights spent hammering beams until my hands bled, days when Daniel was a boy and brought me lemonade while I worked. I had built everything from nothing once. I could build again, even if it meant building a defense instead of a house. But more than defense, I wanted truth. They had painted me as old, incapable, disposable. Yet here I was, planning, strategizing, alive with purpose. For the first time I felt not just anger but a grim sort of hope. The last thing I did before bed was call Brianna my daughter. She lived 2 towns over, busy with her own life, often caught between loyalty to me and the rest of the family. When she picked up, her voice was cautious. Dad, everything okay? I hesitated, then said, just wanted to hear your voice. We spoke briefly, nothing heavy, but as I hung up, I made a silent vow. When the storm broke, she would see the truth, not just about them, but about me. I turned off the light, the notebook locked away once more. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but the foundation of the house held firm. And so did I. The first sign came sooner than I expected. It was Tuesday evening when the phone rang. I recognized Claire's number, though she rarely called me directly. Her voice carried its usual brightness, but underneath I detected a thin wire of tension. Alan, she said, I was just wondering, did you happen to see a notebook at the house last weekend? I can't seem to find it. My grip tightened on the receiver. The notebook rested in my study drawer, locked away. I took a breath and steadied my voice. Notebook? Can't say I noticed. What kind was it? Oh, nothing important, she answered too quickly. Just some recipes and lists. If you come across it, let me know. Her words were light, but the pause that followed told me everything. She was fishing, she already suspected. 2 days later, Daniel showed up unannounced. He hadn't done that in years. I heard the knock on the workshop door just after lunch. Dad, he said when I opened it, forcing a smile. Thought I'd check in, haven't spent much time together lately. I studied him in the doorway. His eyes darted toward the shelves, the tools, the papers stacked neatly on the bench. He was searching for something. Coffee? I asked. Sure. We sat in the kitchen, mugs between us. Daniel made small talk at first, weather, sports, the price of lumber, but then he leaned back, arms crossed. You've been busy, he said. Marcus told me you asked for some documents, ownership stuff. My pulse quickened. Marcus had kept his promise, but Daniel had other ways of finding out. I kept my expression calm. I like to keep things organized. At my age, it's smart to have papers in order. Daniel's smile was thin. Of course, just seemed sudden. We sat in silence for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car. He glanced back once as though measuring me. In that moment, I knew the game had shifted. They no longer believed I was blind. The cracks in their facade were showing. That night the calls began. Claire again, this time with a softness that felt rehearsed. Alan, we've been thinking you shouldn't worry about finances anymore. Let us handle things. You deserve rest. Her words dripped with sugar, but I tasted the steel beneath. They wanted me to hand over control before they had to wrest it. I gave her the same calm answer I'd given Daniel. I'll think about it. In truth, I was already 3 steps ahead. I began carrying the notebook with me in a satchel, never leaving it behind. If they grew desperate enough, they might search the house. Better to keep the evidence close. At the diner, old friends noticed my quieter mood. Everything all right, Alan? One asked. I only nodded. Some truths weren't ready to be shared, not yet, but the tension was building. The following Sunday, I went to church. I don't go often, but that morning I needed the quiet pews, the organ's low hum, the simple act of sitting among people who knew me for more than assets and property lines. During the service, I saw Daniel and Claire slip in late. They never attended unless appearances demanded it. Their eyes flicked across the congregation until they found me. Claire smiled too wide. Daniel's jaw was tight. Afterward, in the courtyard, Claire approached. So good to see you here, Alan. We should have lunch soon, talk about the future. I studied her carefully. Her hands were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale. Behind the performance, worry gnawed at her. "Yes," I said evenly, "we should talk soon." Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, as though she heard more in my tone than I spoke. That night, alone in my study, I replayed every word. They were circling, probing, their confidence shaken but not gone. They still believed they held the upper hand. I flipped open the notebook once more. The pages were filled with their arrogance, their certainty. Exclude permanently, execute transfer. But now I saw more than betrayal. I saw leverage. Every signature, every date, every careless note was a crack in their fortress. And cracks, given time and pressure, widen until the whole wall collapses. I leaned back in my chair, lamp light casting shadows across the room. For the first time, I didn't feel like the one being hunted. I felt like the hunter, patient and steady, waiting for the moment to strike. The facade was crumbling, and when it fell, truth would flood through the ruins. It was Claire's idea to host another dinner. She called on Thursday, her voice a little too bright, a little too insistent. "Alan, we'd love for you to come this Sunday. Family meals keep us close, don't you think?" I almost laughed at the irony. Still, I agreed. Better to face them on their ground than hide in mine. Sunday evening, I drove to their house. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys, and the frost clung silver to the lawns. When I stepped inside, warmth and laughter greeted me, but it felt staged, like a play rehearsed too many times. The dining table was set extravagantly. Candles flickered, silverware gleamed, wine glasses caught the light. Every chair was filled this time except one, my chair. But this time I didn't wait to be invited. I pulled it out myself and sat down, meeting Daniel's eyes across the table. He raised his brows, surprised but silent. Claire poured wine, her hand steady though her smile was stretched thin. Dinner began with chatter about harmless things, the weather, the children's grades, a neighbor's new car, but beneath it the tension pulsed. I felt their glances, quick and measuring. They were waiting for me to show my hand. I didn't, not yet. Instead, I let them talk. Claire steered the conversation toward finances, casually mentioning future plans and adjustments. Daniel chimed in with vague remarks about responsibility and long-term security. I listened, nodding, even smiling. Inside, my mind replayed the words I'd read in their notebook: exclude permanently, transfer by spring. When dessert was served, Claire leaned forward. "Alan, we've been thinking. You've worked so hard all your life. Maybe it's time you let us shoulder some of the burden. Managing accounts, property decisions. It can't be easy at your age." Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes were sharp, watching me for reaction. I set down my fork and folded my hands. "I appreciate your concern, but I've managed just fine. Besides, I've been reviewing the accounts myself." The room went still. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Reviewing, what do you mean?" I held his gaze. "I mean I know what I own, and I intend to keep it that way." For a long moment, silence blanketed the table. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their chatter dying mid-sentence. Claire recovered first, laughing lightly. "Oh, Alan, no one's trying to take anything from you. We're just looking out for your best interest." I let the quiet stretch before answering. Funny thing about best interests, they often sound more like someone else's. Daniel pushed back his chair slightly, the scrape loud against the floor. "Dad, are you accusing us of something?" I leaned back, calm, steady, not accusing, just observing. The air grew heavy. Claire's smile faltered. Daniel's fists clenched on the table. I reached for my wine glass, lifted it slightly, and said to family. My voice was even, but my words carried weight. For the first time their toast was mine, and it wasn't empty. They clinked glasses reluctantly, the sound brittle. The meal ended awkwardly. The children were ushered away, and soon only the three of us remained at the table. Claire gathered plates with quick, sharp movements. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What are you really up to, Dad?" I met his stare. "Protecting what's mine." He froze, just for a second, and I knew then he understood. Somehow, without proof, he sensed I'd seen their blueprint. Claire returned, her face pale but composed. "Alan, we're family, we should trust each other." I smiled, though it held no warmth. "Trust is built, and I've spent a lifetime building." Her eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment fear broke through her facade. When I left, the night was colder than before. My breath curled white in the dark, my footsteps crisp on the frost. Behind me, their windows glowed warm, but the warmth was hollow. In my pocket, I carried a folded page I had slipped from the notebook when no one was watching, a page marked with deadlines and signatures. Proof. As I drove home, headlights cutting through the dark, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The confrontation had stripped away the last pretense. There was no more pretending, no more polite masks. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time, I sensed they knew I wasn't the old fool they imagined. The week after that dinner stretched long and uneasy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept to my routines: coffee at dawn, walks around the property, evenings in my study. But everything carried a sharper edge. Each phone call made me pause before answering. Each envelope in the mailbox felt heavier than paper should. I knew Claire and Daniel were regrouping, scheming, patching the cracks I'd forced open at the table. And I knew sooner or later something would give. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. I had driven into town to pick up supplies when I spotted Daniel's car parked outside Tom Bradley's bank. That alone wasn't unusual, he'd been there before. But what unsettled me was the way he lingered, pacing by the glass doors, phone pressed tight to his ear. I stayed in my truck, engine idling low, and watched. His shoulders were taut, his gestures sharp. At one point he slammed his palm against the roof of his car, frustration spilling out in plain sight. Something in my gut told me he was trying to move faster than I'd expected. When I entered the bank an hour later, Tom greeted me with his usual steady handshake, but his eyes held a flicker of concern. Over coffee in his office, he leaned forward. "Alan," he said carefully, "your son came in asking about joint account access, wanted to know if anything had changed." My stomach tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that accounts are secure, that only you can authorize changes." Relief spread through me, but Tom's expression stayed grave. He didn't take it well, pressed hard, almost desperate. That night, as wind rattled the windows, I sat in my study and opened the notebook again. The page I'd taken from their house lay beside it, the ink darker than I remembered. Transfer by spring. Their deadline loomed closer each day. I thought of Daniel, my boy who once begged me to let him swing the hammer on our first house project. I thought of how proud he'd looked the day I handed him the keys to his first car. Now that same boy was battering at bank doors, trying to pry open the vault of my life. The weight of betrayal pressed hard, but so did a deeper truth. There was no turning back. 2 days later, the breaking point arrived. Claire called, her tone clipped. "Alan, we need to talk. Tonight. At the house." Her words weren't an invitation. They were a summons. I considered refusing, but part of me knew this was the moment the storm had been building toward, so I agreed. When I arrived, the house was dim except for the dining room light. Daniel and Claire sat at the table, papers spread before them. Wine glasses stood untouched. Claire gestured stiffly. "Sit." I remained standing. "What's this about?" Daniel leaned forward, voice tight. "Cut the act, Dad, we know you've seen it, the notebook." The words rang sharp in the room, the last veil torn away. I met his stare. "And if I have?" His jaw clenched. "Then you know we're not backing down. This is happening with or without you." Claire's voice softened, practiced. "Alan, please, you can't manage everything forever. Why not let us take over now while you still have a say?" I almost laughed at the audacity. "While I still have a say" sounds more like "while you can still pretend it's my choice." The room grew colder, though the fire crackled in the hearth. Daniel shoved a stack of papers toward me. "Sign these. It'll make things easier." I didn't even glance at them. "No." His eyes darkened. "Then you'll regret it." The words hung heavy, a threat too raw to be disguised. I straightened, my voice steady. "The only regret here will be yours, because you assumed I was too old, too blind, too weak. But I've built my life on foundations stronger than your schemes." Claire's mask cracked then, her face twisting in anger. "You're standing in the way of the future." I leaned closer, my tone low. "No, I'm standing in the way of your theft." For a long moment none of us spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking on the mantel, steady as a drumbeat. Finally, Daniel shoved back his chair, the legs screeching against the floor. "If you won't cooperate, we'll force it legally. You'll lose everything." I smiled faintly. I wouldn't be so sure. Because in my satchel, resting against the chair leg, lay the notebook. Their words, their signatures, their plan, all in my possession. I left without another word. The cold air outside felt almost cleansing, cutting through the stench of that room. As I walked to my truck, I knew the storm had broken. There would be no more masks, no more careful half-truths. The battle was open now. The breaking point had come, and I was ready. The morning after that confrontation, I rose before the sun. Sleep had been scarce, but resolve carried me. The house was hushed, the only sound the radiator hissing faintly in the corner. I brewed coffee strong and black, then unlocked the drawer where the notebook rested. I laid it open on the table, its pages glowing under the lamp. Each line, each note of theirs was no longer just betrayal, it was evidence. They had written their intentions so clearly, so arrogantly, that even a stranger could see the conspiracy. I slipped the notebook into my satchel. Today was the day I stopped playing defense. My first stop was Marcus Webb's office. He greeted me with cautious respect, already aware from whispers that something was brewing. "Marcus," I said, setting the notebook on his desk, "I need you to look this over. Tell me what it means legally." He flipped through the pages, his brows knitting deeper with each one. After a while, he closed it and looked me straight in the eye. "Alan, this isn't planning. This is a paper trail. If they tried to execute any of this, it would be considered fraud at best. At worst, criminal conspiracy." The words steadied me. "Then we make sure it's seen for what it is." Marcus nodded. "I'll prepare summaries, keep copies safe, but Alan, be careful. When people get desperate, they get reckless." I understood. I had seen it in Daniel's eyes already. From there, I walked across town to Tom Bradley at the bank. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the way serious rooms should. I placed the notebook in front of him, open to the page marked "Exclude permanently." He read in silence, lips pressed tight. Finally, he closed the book. I knew they were pressing, but this, "Alan, they're playing with fire. No bank in this town will back them once this surfaces." "Good," I said, "because I intend to cut off every route they thought they had." Tom leaned back, studying me. "You've always built, Alan. Now you're dismantling. Are you ready for that?" I met his gaze. "I'm not dismantling, I'm protecting. There's a difference." By afternoon, I had what I needed: secure accounts, documented evidence, allies who had seen the truth with their own eyes. But I wasn't done. I called an old friend, Jim Morrison, who chaired the local Chamber of Commerce. We met in a corner booth at the diner. I slid the page I'd taken from their house across the table. Jim read it slowly, then whistled under his breath. "Alan, this isn't just family squabbling. They're trying to erase you. That's why I'm showing you. When they start telling their story that I'm unfit, incapable, I need people to know the facts first." Jim nodded firmly. "You've given more to this town than most men combined. You'll have support." His words felt like bricks slotting into a wall I was building around myself, strong, protective, unbreakable. That evening, back at my house, I sat by the fire with the notebook on my lap. Flames licked the wood, shadows danced across the walls I had built with my own hands. I thought of Claire's voice. "Sign these. It'll make things easier." I thought of Daniel's threat, "You'll regret it." And then I thought of my granddaughter Lucy slipping me that flimsy paper crown, her smile bright and unguarded. That was why I fought. Not for money, not even for pride, but for legacy, for truth, for the child who still believed her grandfather was worth crowning. The phone rang just after 9. Marcus again. "Alan, I've spoken with a lawyer I trust. He's discreet but sharp. If you want, he'll file preliminary measures, injunctions to freeze any transfer attempts. All we need is your go-ahead." I stared at the flames, then at the notebook. "Do it." When I hung up, a strange calm filled me. For weeks, I had felt like prey, cornered and watched, but now the balance had shifted. I had set the pieces in motion, and they didn't even know the ground beneath them was shifting. Later that night, as I locked the notebook away once more, I whispered aloud into the quiet room. "You thought I wouldn't fight. You thought wrong. This time I build not for you, not for them, but for me." The words echoed softly, swallowed by the old walls, but I knew they would carry, because tomorrow the tables would turn. And when they did, the house they tried to steal would no longer feel like theirs. It would feel like what it had always been, mine. News in a small town travels faster than any car I've ever driven. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to circle, quiet at first, then louder. I hadn't said much, just shown a page or two of the notebook to the right people, trusted friends who carried respect. But that was enough. By Friday morning, when I walked into the diner, conversations hushed. Heads turned and then turned back. The waitress poured my coffee without asking, her hand warm on my shoulder. "You hang in there, Alan," she said softly. It was a strange kind of comfort, not noisy or dramatic, but steady. My life's work, those roofs I built, the homes I repaired, the jobs I gave to men when times were lean, was speaking for me now. That afternoon, Jim Morrison invited me to the Chamber of Commerce meeting. I almost didn't go. The thought of standing in front of my peers, laying bare the betrayal of my own son, made me feel hollow. But when I arrived, I realized it wasn't pity in their eyes, it was solidarity. Jim cleared his throat. "Alan, maybe you should explain what's going on." I set the notebook on the table, open to the line circled in red, "Exclude permanently." My voice didn't waver. "My family has been planning to erase me, my business, my property, even my place in my own home. They wrote it all down, every step." A ripple moved through the room. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered curses under their breath. I closed the book. "I'm not here to shame them. I'm here to say I won't be silent, and I'll fight this the way I've built everything else, with patience, with proof, and with help from those who know me." The applause wasn't loud, but it was steady, sure, and in that moment I knew I wasn't alone. The next day Claire called again. Her tone was different this time, tight, brittle. "Alan, people are talking. What exactly have you been saying?" I let the silence stretch before answering. "Only the truth." "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she snapped. "No, Claire," I said quietly, "you are." She hung up without another word. On Sunday I attended church again. When I walked into the vestibule, hands reached out to shake mine, voices murmured encouragement. The pastor paused during the service to say, "We should remember those among us facing trials, even from those closest to them. Strength and honesty will carry the day." I didn't look around, but I knew Claire and Daniel heard every word. They sat 3 pews behind, stiff as stone. Afterward, a neighbor approached me. "Alan, if you need witnesses, if you need someone to speak on your behalf, I'll stand with you. We all know the kind of man you are." I nodded, throat tight. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reputation, dignity, legacy. And in that court, the court of opinion, I had already won ground. That evening I walked the property again. The oak tree stood bare against the winter sky, branches reaching like arms. My boots crunched over frozen soil, each step reminding me this land was mine, not because of ink or signatures, but because I had shaped it, tended it, lived it. Inside, by the fire, I opened the notebook once more. Its pages no longer filled me with despair. They filled me with clarity. Their arrogance had become my weapon. And now the community knew. They had seen enough to understand the truth. I thought of Lucy again, her small hand pressing that paper crown into mine. Someday she would ask why her grandfather fought so hard, and I would tell her because silence builds nothing. The phone rang late that night. This time it was Daniel. His voice was strained, the mask slipping. "Dad, stop, you're ruining us." I held the receiver tight. "No, son, you're ruining yourselves. I'm just shining a light." For a moment, I thought he might cry, but then the hardness returned. "If you take this public, you'll regret it." "I already have regrets," I said, "but standing up for myself won't be one of them." When I set the phone down, my hands no longer trembled. The battle had shifted. No longer was it a private struggle whispered behind closed doors. It was now out in the open, where reputation stood or fell. And in that court, the court of opinion, I wasn't the old fool they had painted. I was Alan Cole, builder, father, survivor, and I was just getting started. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, tucked into a plain white envelope that looked harmless enough. But the bold print across the top, notice of petition, told me otherwise. Claire's handwriting wasn't on it. No, this was all Daniel. His style was stamped across every phrase, polished and cold. They were filing for emergency spousal support, claiming I had cut Claire off from necessary funds. The words dripped with legal jargon, but beneath them I could hear his voice. We'll paint him as controlling. We'll strip away his credibility before anyone listens to his side. I set the papers down, the fire snapping in the hearth beside me. My house had never felt so quiet. For a moment anger surged, thick, hot, ready to burn everything down, but then just as quickly it ebbed. This wasn't a fight for fists or rage. It was a fight for patience, strategy, truth. The next morning, I sat in my lawyer's office, a cramped space lined with books that smelled of dust and experience. James Morrison was a friend as much as an attorney, a man who'd hammered nails beside me in my early days before trading blueprints for legal briefs. He scanned the petition, eyebrows raised. They're claiming financial abuse. Classic tactic, he wants to flip the narrative. Can they? I asked. They can try. But you've kept records, Alan, bank statements, transfers, payroll. You've always run a clean ledger. That's going to matter. I slid the notebook across the desk, the one I had pulled from beneath Daniel's careless folder. James opened it and I watched his face shift as he read. Exclude permanently. Divide assets quietly. Leverage psychological evaluation. He looked up, his jaw set. They've just handed us their own noose. Court day arrived under a gray sky. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn at Brianna's graduation, the one Claire used to say made me look distinguished. I didn't wear it for her. I wore it for myself, a reminder that I was still the man who had built something from nothing. The courthouse smelled of polish and echoes, every footstep magnified. Claire sat at the petitioner's table, her posture fragile, eyes downcast, playing the part of the weary, mistreated wife. Daniel leaned close to her, whispering strategy, his tie perfectly knotted, his smirk hidden behind the mask of professional concern. When the judge called my name, I rose slowly, deliberately. My lawyer stood beside me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Claire. 25 years of shared life condensed into this performance. Claire spoke first. Her voice trembled just enough. Your Honor, my husband has restricted my access to our accounts, leaving me unable to cover basic expenses. I fear for my security. Daniel added with practiced gravity, this is a textbook case of financial abuse. We ask for immediate relief, spousal support and exclusive control of the marital home until proceedings conclude. Their words hung heavy in the room. For anyone who didn't know better, it could have sounded convincing. Then James cleared his throat. Your Honor, before we proceed, we'd like to submit Exhibit A. The clerk pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the chamber, not my Margaret, but Claire's voice on tape, crisp and cruel. Once the old man signs, we'll have everything we planned for. Then Daniel's will frame it as abuse. He'll look controlling. The courtroom shifted. Even the judge's expression faltered. I didn't look at Claire as the recording played. I couldn't, but I heard the gasps ripple through the benches behind us. Every word they had whispered in shadows now echoed under fluorescent lights, immortalized on tape. When it ended, silence swallowed the room. James spoke evenly. Your Honor, this petition is not about protection. It's about conspiracy. My client has been the target of a calculated scheme to strip him of assets and dignity. The notebook before you details their plan. The recording confirms it. The truth requires no embellishment. The judge's gavel struck once. Petition denied. This matter will be referred for further investigation. Claire's face drained of color. Daniel clenched his jaw, his perfect mask cracking at the edges. For the first time, they looked small, cornered animals, realizing the cage door had swung shut. Outside the courthouse, the cold air felt clean. I inhaled deeply, letting it wash through me. Reporters hadn't gathered. This was still just a family matter, but the eyes of neighbors, colleagues, and old friends were enough. One man approached me, a carpenter I hadn't seen in years. Alan, I worked a job with you back in '98. You always paid on time, even when things were tight. Don't let them tell it different. I shook his hand. His words mattered more than he knew. That night I sat alone in the living room. The fire cast shadows on the walls and the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was steady, purposeful. For the first time in months I felt the scales tipping, not just in my favor but toward justice. Yet deep down I knew this wasn't the end. People like Daniel didn't accept defeat quietly, and Claire, she had lost face, lost ground. That kind of humiliation often drove people to desperate choices. The war wasn't over, but I had won the first battle. And in that quiet moment, watching the flames curl and break, I promised myself I would not stop until the truth stood taller than every lie. The cracks began to show sooner than I expected. By the weekend, word had spread, not just about the denied petition but about the recording itself. Small towns don't need newspapers to carry gossip. Whispers ride faster than headlines. At the hardware store, I overheard two men by the paint aisle. She really thought she'd take him for everything. One muttered, "Imagine scheming with your own son-in-law," the other replied. They glanced at me when I walked past, but their looks weren't pitying. They were angry on my behalf, the kind of anger that builds alliances without asking. Daniel must have sensed the shift too, because on Monday morning he showed up at my driveway. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel like they didn't belong there. "Dad," he started, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned on the fence post, arms crossed. "About what?" "Your failed performance in court." His jaw tightened. "You're destroying Claire. She can't sleep, she can't eat, this crusade of yours." I cut him off. "She destroyed herself the moment she put her name next to yours in that notebook." For a second I saw something flicker in his eyes, not confidence, not rage, but fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar lawyer's mask. "You'll regret this," he muttered before retreating to his Lexus, tires spitting gravel as he sped away. That night Brianna called. "Dad," she whispered, "Mom and Daniel were fighting." I stopped by the house to drop off Lucy's jacket and I heard them through the door. "What did you hear?" "Accusations. He said she slipped up, that she should have kept her mouth shut around the neighbors. She screamed that he was supposed to protect her, not let everything fall apart." I pictured the two of them, once so confident in their conspiracy, now turning their claws on each other. "They're breaking, sweetheart. Stay clear of them." Her voice trembled. "I will, but Dad, Mom doesn't sound defeated, she sounds desperate." By midweek, desperation turned visible. Claire appeared at church committee, face pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She tried to carry herself with the grace people remembered, but the murmurs around her told another story. Invitations had stopped arriving. Old friends crossed the street rather than face her. When she caught my eye across the room, I didn't see a wife of 25 years. I saw someone cornered, calculating, clinging to scraps of dignity. Daniel, meanwhile, was drowning in his own storm. A colleague of mine, Jim Morrison, called to say the Bar Association had accelerated their investigation. Contractors he'd cheated were lining up to testify. "He's finished, Alan," Jim said. "Even if he somehow dodges disbarment, his reputation is gone." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something colder. Vindication is sharp, but it doesn't fill the emptiness betrayal leaves behind. That Friday, the phone rang again. This time it was Claire herself. "Alan," she said, voice brittle, "can we meet? Just the two of us." I hesitated. "Where?" "The old park tomorrow morning." I almost refused, but curiosity, or maybe the need for finality, pushed me to agree. The park hadn't changed in years. The swing still creaked with rust, the fountain dry and cracked. We'd brought Brianna here once for picnics, long before the rot set in. Claire was already on the bench when I arrived, wrapped in a coat that seemed to swallow her frame. For a moment she looked like the woman I once knew, waiting with a thermos of coffee, smiling up at me, but the smile never came. "You've turned everyone against me," she said flatly. "No, Claire, you did that when you tried to erase me." Her hands clenched in her lap. "Do you know what it's like, Alan, to live in your shadow, to never have enough, no matter how much you provided?" I almost laughed. "Not enough, the house, the cars, the vacations." "It was never about the things," she snapped. "It was about you, about your name stamped on every contract, every wall, every brick. I wanted something of my own." Her words cut deeper than I expected. She hadn't just wanted wealth, she'd wanted recognition, a crown I'd never thought to share. "And so you sold me out to Daniel?" I asked. Her silence was answer enough. We sat in the brittle winter air, the swings rattling faintly in the wind. Finally she spoke again, softer this time. "It's falling apart, Alan. He's turning on me, the whole plan gone. I don't know what happens next." For a fleeting second I glimpsed the truth behind her mask, fear raw and unvarnished. "You face the consequences," I said, "like the rest of us do when we make mistakes." Her eyes flashed, part anger, part pleading. "And if I told you I was sorry, then I'd tell you it's too late." When I walked away from that bench, I didn't look back. Her figure stayed there, small against the empty park, swallowed by shadows. That night Brianna texted me, "Mom's been calling nonstop. Dan won't answer her. She sounds frantic." I typed back carefully, "Let them unravel. Don't get pulled in." For the first time in months I slept soundly. Not because the war was over, but because the enemy was finally fighting itself. The breaking point had come, and from here there would be no turning back. It was a Tuesday evening when the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the windows of my office, the kind that drowns out thought, leaving only rhythm. I had been reviewing invoices when my phone buzzed. It was Mike Rodriguez, the investigator I'd quietly hired weeks before. "They're planning something, Alan," he said. "I've got recordings. You'll want to hear this." The static gave way to Claire's voice, sharp and frantic. "If we don't do it now, it's over. He's won. Everyone's turned against me." Daniel's reply was low but urgent. "Then we push harder. We file police reports. We make him the aggressor. If we can't win in court, we'll bury him in accusations." I sat back, the leather creaking beneath me. They weren't done, not yet. They were willing to scorch the earth just to salvage pride. The next morning I found the proof slipped beneath my office door. Mike had delivered transcripts, neatly bound, time-stamped. Their desperation was etched in every line. False claims, threats of restraining orders, fabrications of abuse. I stared at those pages, my hand steady. I had once feared their schemes. Now I saw them for what they were, desperate acts of people drowning. By Thursday the rumors had spread again. Claire had been seen entering the police station with Daniel, clutching a folder thick with papers. They walked out hours later, faces pale, avoiding every eye. That evening, I received a call from Officer Jenkins, a man I'd played poker with for years. "Alan," he said gently, "they came in with allegations, but once we looked closer, well, let's just say the story doesn't add up, especially with what you've already provided." I exhaled, slow and steady. "So it's over." "Not quite, but they've crossed into criminal territory now. Filing false reports isn't a game." The breaking point became collapse. Daniel's office received notice of disciplinary review, not just for finances but for ethical violations tied to Claire's claims. Witnesses came forward, neighbors, clerks, even a waiter who'd overheard them whispering strategy over wine. And Claire, her world shrank to whispers and cold shoulders. At the club, women she once ruled over now turned away. At church, her pew sat empty, her absence louder than presence. But it wasn't victory that filled me. It was weariness, the kind that settles after a storm when you realize the damage still has to be cleaned. One evening, Brianna came by with Lucy. The little girl darted into my arms, her laughter breaking through the heaviness. "Grandpa, can I stay here tonight?" she asked. I looked at Brianna. She nodded. "She'll be safe here." We sat by the fire while Lucy colored on the rug. Brianna's eyes glistened. "Mom called again. She said you ruined her life." I sighed. She ruined her own life when she chose betrayal. Brianna's voice trembled but held firm. "I believe you. I've seen the evidence. But it still hurts, Dad, to lose a mother this way." I put my hand over hers. "We don't lose everything, sweetheart. We hold on to what's honest. That's all that matters." The final betrayal came on a Sunday morning. Claire left a letter in my mailbox, the ink smudged, the handwriting shaky. "Alan, I never wanted it to end this way. I thought if I had enough, I'd finally feel seen. Instead, I've lost everything. Daniel blames me. The town shuns me. And you stand taller than ever. Perhaps you always were the stronger one. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I never hated you. I only hated the shadow I lived in." I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the same drawer as the notebook. the record of their conspiracy and now their confession. Together they told the whole story: ambition, betrayal, and downfall. That night I walked the property once more. The oak tree stood tall against the starlit sky, branches heavy with the season's weight. I rested my hand on its bark, rough but enduring. The rain had cleared. The air was sharp, honest, and for the first time in months I felt something close to peace. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to twist love into weapon, generosity into control, but in the end they erased only themselves. The last betrayal wasn't theirs, it was mine. I had betrayed my old self, the man too willing to stay silent, too willing to carry the weight alone. No more. The house was quiet again. Not hollow the way it had been in those first weeks of discovery, but quiet in the way a field rests after harvest, emptied of noise, yet full of promise. I woke early these days, not from worry but from habit. The kettle whistled, the radio hummed softly with the morning farm report, and sunlight reached through the kitchen windows just as it always had. But the silence felt different now. It belonged to me. One evening, I took Lucy out to the back porch. She was still young enough to believe fireflies carried messages. She darted after them, her laughter rising into the dusk. "Grandpa," she said between breaths, "is this your castle?" I looked at the house, its bricks weathered but sturdy, the oak tree guarding it like a sentinel. I smiled. "Something like that, built it with my own hands." She nodded as if that explained everything, then returned to chasing light. The town had shifted too. Men I'd known for decades shook my hand longer than before. Neighbors dropped pies at my door. The Chamber of Commerce asked me to speak about resilience, though I politely declined. I didn't need a stage. The life I lived was statement enough. Daniel's name vanished from business circles. Last I heard, he'd left the state, his law license gone, his pride packed into cardboard boxes. Claire worked part-time at a boutique in another town. People rarely mentioned her now, and when they did, it was with a mixture of pity and distance. I didn't celebrate their downfall. The satisfaction had already passed. What lingered was clarity. Betrayal is a wound, yes, but it also strips away illusions. You learn who you are when everything else is burned off. Inside, the notebook still sat in my desk drawer. Some nights I opened it, not out of anger, but as a reminder. The pages no longer hurt. They taught. They showed me the cost of silence, the danger of trust without question, the sharp edges of love when it's twisted by greed. I kept it because Lucy would one day be old enough to read it. When she asked why her family was fractured, I wanted the truth to be ready, written in their own words. Brianna came often. She brought work from her counseling practice, sometimes spreading files across the dining table while I fixed dinner. We spoke of clients, of Lucy's school, of the small things that stitched a life together. Rarely did we speak of Claire. One evening, she paused while grading a report. "Dad," she said quietly, "do you regret it all, the years, the marriage?" I stirred the pot of stew before answering. "No, I regret the lies, not the time. Those years built you, built this home. Regret has no place where love once lived, even if that love turned out to be something else." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded, tears glimmering but unshed. On Sundays I returned to church. My pew was the same, but the view had changed. I no longer watched the back of Claire's head, her hair perfectly styled. Instead, I watched the light streaming through stained glass, scattering color across the floor. The pastor spoke once about forgiveness. Not the kind that erases wrongdoing, but the kind that frees the one who carries the weight. I thought of Claire. I didn't know if I had forgiven her, not completely. But I knew I no longer carried the anger like a stone in my chest. That was enough for now. The seasons shifted. Spring returned, the oak sprouting fresh leaves. I built a swing for Lucy, the ropes tied firm, the seat sanded smooth. Her squeals filled the yard as she swung higher, her feet kicking at the sky. Watching her, I realized something. My legacy wasn't the business I built or the contracts I signed. It wasn't even the house or the land. My legacy was this: a child's laughter echoing across the years, proof that love, when tended, outlives betrayal. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked through each room of the house. The photographs still hung on the walls, weddings, birthdays, holidays. I hadn't taken them down. They told a story even if part of it was false, and I had no interest in rewriting the past. Instead, I let the pictures stand as markers, reminders of both what was given and what was taken. Life isn't clean, after all. It's a mixture, joy beside grief, love beside betrayal. To erase one would be to diminish the other. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought of the journey. From the first suspicion to the courtroom, from despair to clarity, from silence to voice. It wasn't the ending I had once imagined for my life, but it was mine. I leaned back, the flames warming my hands. "This house," I whispered to the empty room, "is finally honest." And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. If you found meaning in my story, if it stirred anger, or hope, or simply reminded you of the strength hidden in silence, consider leaving a comment. Share your own thoughts or your own battles. It helps more than you think. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories where truth eventually finds its voice. Thank you for listening.